All right.
So when we consider the perspective offered by McLaren 2003 and Rozich 2016 on critical pedagogy, how are these the same? How are they different? Well, with Rozich, she's speaking from her own personal experience and her own personal implementation in her classroom. And then with McLaren,
He's speaking more theoretically in the kind of implementation of like societal constructs such as ideology, discourse, and culture, and how they affect like the transmission of knowledge to anybody.
yeah. Okay. So with Rozich, she approaches the critical pedagogy from the view, like the approach as a scholar, as an individual, and as a teacher. And she also looks at the various ways in which we implement critical pedagogy within different classrooms by looking at different educators' methods, kind of as a guide for her own. What about McLaren? Does he focus on is it his own implementation, or is it just theoretically?
So he focuses on the power of society to control the transmission of knowledge through our norms, our culture, and the way we have acceptable dialogue. So he's more of a philosopher than an individual or a teacher.
Okay. But they both really address student needs on a cultural basis. And McLaren and Rozich both use the students' cultures and experiences as the basis for their lessons, right?
Yeah. Where Rozich is kind of specifying certain individuals, he's more speaking of like how these constructs affect everybody.
Oh, okay. So they're both using the lens, but McLaren's more in practice, where Rozich's more in actual critical pedagogy and implementation of it.
Yeah.
Okay. So what is the relationship between critical pedagogy and practice?
So I think the actual relationship is that critical pedagogy is the lens that you implement the practice through.
Oh, okay.
Kind of like the flavor.
I agree, and teachers really need to do a lot of self-reflection to know their own bias before you can teach your students, because self-reflection leads to better education, right?
I think they're going to definitely teach their students more effectively if they consider their own positionality before they approach their students' positionality.
Okay. So where do you think formative assessment and feedback falls within critical pedagogy?
I think because it's harder to plan for critical pedagogy, frequent assessment is necessary to guide the lesson narrative as you try to figure out what that narrative is for your students.
Okay. Yeah. And formative assessments are really important because it shows where the students are, but feedback can be used to guide them to where they need to be, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So what are the challenges? I know Rozich talks extensively about the challenges in which she has implementing this in her own classroom. What about your classroom? How do you think you're going to do it?
Me?
Yeah.
I think that I'm going to have to take the extra time and effort to try to get to know my students and understand their backgrounds and find a way for that to be informative to my lessons. And I think it can be kind of difficult, and I've struggled with it already, to find a way to do it that's meaningful and not like kind of surface level and not meaningful.
Okay. See, I think my challenges would really be the scaffolding, the modeling to get my students to a point in which they can have like Socratic seminars and those academic educational discussions. Because with a lot of, just like how Rozich was saying, with my students, they're very opinionated. They're opinionated, but they're not really sure how to say that. So I think my main challenge would be to implement a system in which that they become comfortable and able to have those discussions.
Yeah, that's awesome. Kind of like, giving them the proper vehicle to express those opinions.
Yeah, exactly.
So it seems like maybe your students are already on their way and just need to be like
the structure.
Yeah, just give them a little of that scaffolding that you were talking about. That's pretty cool.
And with the same thing, you got to be aware of your own positionality, right? Like your own place in the power structure with students. I think as a Caucasian female from a upper middle class growing up, I really need to do a lot of self-reflection and be aware of my power as the authoritative figure when a lot of my students are from differing ethnicities, nationalities, religions, and different socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
So, what about you?
So I think my own positionality,
Yeah.
I have no problem like relating to my students, my more disruptive students at least.
Mm-hmm.
And because I came from a low income environment where I didn't take school very seriously, and it's easy for me to kind of see where they're coming from. And they appreciate that about me too. And I really have an easy time connecting. I think the harder time I have connecting is with my better students who are there to take this seriously. Fortunately, though, I feel like they don't need as much connection from me anyways. So it's kind of cool. So far, as far as my own positionality, I think it's been a benefit to me in the classroom.
Okay. I think with my positionality, and I also have a little bit of expert blindness, because I know so much about like biology and science that I have trouble putting it on in terms in which like to adapt for the developmental age and the scientific knowledge levels of my students, right? Immediately go to like more higher nomenclature, like the verbiage I use is a lot higher than they're used to because I have like that expert blindness. Do you ever have that problem?
I have a similar problem, but maybe on a different spectrum. So I frequently switch into like a lower level speaking form, and I think that can be relational to kids, but also like sometimes while I'm describing it in an easier to understand way, I'm leaving out a lot of our academic vocabulary that I should be reinforcing. So sometimes I feel like I need to actually increase my expectations and my my biology skills that are there to for the benefit of our students or my students.
Okay. So when you're teaching from a critical perspective in a classroom, how do you think that's different than a more traditional normal classroom?
For science, especially, I think that I think it's easy to get lost in the science and forget about everybody's backgrounds and forget about everybody's perspectives and focus on like the nuts and bolts. Where I think as science educators, we really do need to take that extra effort to consider that about our students.
Okay.
What do you think?
I think that it's a huge difference because with a lot of the science we teach, it is mainly focused on the scientific contributions of like white male European scientists, some American, but mostly European scientists. So I think in my future classrooms, I would really like to include the scientific contributions, like when I'm talking about evolution and other types of biology and physics or whatever, that I include scientific contributions from scientists of different ethnicities, nationalities, religions, genders, languages. Because like when I'm teaching evolution, of course, I'm going to talk about Charles Darwin, but I'm also going to talk about Abu Uthan Amir Ibn Bar Kanani Al-Fujar Habasri, who was actually the first person to talk about evolutionary biology and zoology, and it's a long name, but he was from the 9th century, and he went by Al-Jahiz, and he was also known as the first Islamic zoologist. And he lived from 1781 to 1869, but his was actually the first published work about evolutionary biology from a zoological point of view.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't know that, so I think maybe if we implement scientists like that in our curriculum. So when we're talking about evolution, we don't just talk about Darwin's contribution, we talk about Al-Jahiz's contributions. Like when we're talking about DNA, we don't talk about Watson and Crick. We also talk about other people who did it, like Rosalind Franklin, who was the one that came up with the double helix.
Yeah.
But they didn't
credit her. Yeah.
They didn't credit her for anything, and then a month after she died, they awarded the Nobel Prize to Watson and Crick that used her research to make the 3D model.
Yeah. There's a lot of sad stuff like that in history.
Yeah, but we can be that difference. With critical pedagogy, we can implement those differing scientists in the scientific classroom while still teaching the curriculum.
That's a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, but we're up for it.
I think we're up for it.